Welcome to the New York Times Book Review Podcast. I'm Gilbert Cruz, the new editor of the Books Desk, and for the next many months we'll be highlighting great author interviews from our decade-plus archive. We're planning a new iteration of this podcast, and as a result, we need to use the rest of the year to figure out what that might sound like. Until then, we hope you enjoyed this trip down memory lane. Today we have two conversations. The first is a short one from 2010 with Jennifer Egan. This year, she published her novel The Candy House, a sort of sequel to A Visit from the Goon Squad. You don't have to read or reread Goon Squad to enjoy The Candy House, but listening to Egan's talk with then book review editor Sam Tanenhaus will serve as a good refresher for that first book. Our second conversation is between Pamela Paul and the actor and author Stephen Fry. It was recorded in June 2020, that first summer of the pandemic, and Fry discusses his love for Oscar Wilde and the other books and authors which inspired his love for language and reading.
With every new novel, Jennifer Egan is emerging as one of our very best novelists. Her latest is called A Visit from the Goon Squad. It's reviewed on our cover by Will Blythe, who calls it a remarkable new fiction, often darkly, rippingly funny. He says Egan possesses a satirist's eye and a romance novelist's heart, and she has perfect pitch. I'm delighted that Jennifer Egan is here to talk about her new novel. Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, let's start with one of our two main characters. I guess we could call her a heroine. She's also a klepto. We meet her in the first chapter. Who is she?
Her name is Sasha, and we meet her in the bathroom, a ladies' room at a fancy hotel where she's just spotted a wallet underneath a sink. And realizes that the wallet's owner is actually in the bathroom stall, and she takes it and leaves the bathroom. And when I began this book, which really began with that moment, that was really all I knew about her. I just knew that she was a person who took a wallet and walked out the door of the bathroom. And in a way, the whole book spun out from that. I quickly realized as I was writing that she was having her first meeting with a guy she had met online. So she's actually on a date.
This is Alex.
This is Alex. Right. Yes. Her date. The date is not going well, but she gets a kind of charge from having taken the wallet that immediately turns the date around. She's feeling kind of excited and jittery in a good way.
Well, they go back to her apartment, right? And they see, I don't want to give too much away, but it's only the beginning of the novel. On a table, there are all kinds of items that she has collected.
Yes, she doesn't really think of it as stealing. She calls it lifting, and she only likes to take things from people. She doesn't actually steal from stores. So there's something sort of strange going on there in her mind. And she does take a little something from Alex, not a big thing, but kind of a symbolic thing. She also, in the course of that first chapter, runs into the person whose wallet she's stolen. And the real drama of that first part is the confrontation between these two women. In the course of writing that first chapter, that I mentioned in passing that Sasha had been regaling her date, or trying to, with tales of her former boss, and his name is Benny Salazar. And I wrote that she tells her date that he sprinkles gold flakes into his coffee and sprays pesticide in his armpits. He's a record producer. And at the time, I just intended that as kind of an amusing thumbnail sketch of a decadent music producer. But then I found myself thinking, so who does those things and why? And I began the next chapter about Benny Salazar, her boss, and it takes place earlier when Sasha still works for him. So we've had this kind of crazy view into her inner life as a person who's compelled to steal. Then we just meet her in the role of assistant in the course of Benny's rather wild flailings as he deals with divorce and various other problems, and indeed is spraying pesticide in his armpits and sprinkling gold into his coffee.
Well, and then as the novel proceeds, as Will Blythe says, not to alarm listeners, but to entice them, you do something very bold here, which is to spin the story out in many different directions following different characters. Who are some of the others?
Let's see. Well, later we meet one of Sasha's children, actually. So that story takes place in the future. And the 12-year-old girl keeps her journal of family life in the form of PowerPoint. So there's a 76-slide PowerPoint presentation, which is this 12-year-old's journal describing her family life in the California desert. There's a disgraced publicist named Dolly, who has caused a huge amount of trouble at a gigantic party she gave, but now is trying to make ends meet by basically going on a retainer with a despot to try to revive his reputation and make him seem nice. And let's see, we meet Alex, the date, Sasha's date from the first chapter many years later when he's approaching middle age. So what I was really interested in was trying to move through time and work with that difference between private and public. You know, we see people and they seem to be easily categorizable. Sometimes they seem like types. And I loved then taking that person that we had seen peripherally and showing us that person's inner life in a really immediate way. And I tried to do that as much as possible. And at the same time, capture those surprises that we have when time passes and we suddenly realize that somehow we always experience it as a surprise, even though it's happening all the time and very gradual. But just that shock of realizing that time has passed and everyone and everything is a little different.
And Jennifer, something our reviewer Will Blythe points out is that this is a book that's very carefully poised between being linked stories on the one hand and a more traditional novel on the other. How do you strike that balance so that these different voices and this passage through time is connected?
Well, it happened very organically because, as I said, my curiosity was caught by one person after another, and I just followed the trail of my own curiosity. Ultimately, I was not sure how I should organize this. I tried not to worry about the question of whether it was stories or a novel, because those are really just categories. They're marketing categories. So I tried to put that to the side. Once I realized that the book was emerging in this peripatetic way, I set up 3 ground rules, which guided me. Number 1 was that each chapter had to be about a different person. So someone could only be the subject once. People reappear many times, but they can only be the subject once. Number 2 is that each chapter has to have a very different feel, and that I achieve mostly through different technical choices. So one chapter is in the second person. One chapter is told as a celebrity profile. I mentioned the PowerPoint. I tried to just do as many things as I could technically to give each chapter a completely different feel. And finally, each chapter had to stand completely on its own and not require anything around it to exist, to work as a unit.
Didn't one chapter appear in the New Yorker?
3 actually did over the years. Yeah, a number of them were published.
As separate stories. I remember reading one and thinking this was a short story you'd written.
I guess I felt like it was worth sending those out because I thought, look, they're supposed to stand on their own legs. Let them go out there and do that. And yet they all have this secret life, which is about the way that they interweave and connect. So anyway, so I really hewed to those principles, and it resulted in my having to leave out a bunch of stuff that I would have loved to include. I mean, there were a number of chapters that I just couldn't make work. I couldn't make them meet all of those criteria.
Chapters you completed, that you wrote complete drafts of?
Tried. Oh, yeah. Worked on for months, actually. Certain peripheral characters that I really wanted to break open and make available for the reader, but I couldn't do it without either repeating myself in terms of the world and the feel of the chapter, or I couldn't really make them stand up without the stuff around them. They just didn't finally work. I tried a couple of times to write a second chapter about the same person that I had before, so I tried breaking that rule. It didn't work. I somehow had to hold to those rules.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer.
My pleasure.
Stephen Fry joins us now from the countryside in England. His newest book is called Heroes, The Greek Myths Reimagined. Stephen, thank you so much for being here.
It's a real pleasure, Pamela. Nice to talk to you.
I don't usually do this, but I am going to start with a little bit of gushing on a somewhat different topic, but it's a literary topic at least. I remember first seeing you in the film Wild when it came out in 1997. I was living in London at the time, and I had only recently read Richard Ellman's biography of Wilde. And I know you're a huge fan of Oscar Wilde. I'm just curious, if you talk a little bit about how you came to his work as a reader and as an actor.
Well, I'll tell you, it is a strange story in a way, a rather appealing one, I suppose. I grew up in exactly the same part of the countryside where I'm currently sheltering in place. And it was miles, as the great wit and divine Sidney Smith said, simply miles from the nearest lemon. In other words, deep in the countryside, far from shops and civilization, and even from libraries. My parents were both, academically very advanced. My father's a physicist, my mother a historian, and so there were lots of books. But every 2 weeks or so, a mobile library would come trundling along, a sort of van or truck would come along, and about a quarter of a mile from the house would park on the corner of 2 lanes. And I would trot along and get on. And I remember one Sunday, I was watching television, which was a very rare thing indeed for me because my father didn't approve of it. And we had only a tiny little black and white set kept in a cupboard, which would come out for royal weddings or the death of Churchill or the moon landing or things of great significance, but otherwise was really locked away like the madwoman in the attic that my father regarded television as being, and probably rightly. Anyway, it was raining and he was out working, and he had a laboratory in the stable blocks of the house. He was a sort of, as I say, an inventor physicist. And I saw this film, and people in it, I was about 10 or 11 years old, people were speaking in the most remarkable way that I'd ever heard. I couldn't quite believe what I was listening to. There was a young man who said to a girl, "I hope I will not in any way offend you if I say that you seem to me to be the visible personification of absolute perfection." And I remember thinking, what? And it was such a phrase that I had to repeat it and repeat it. And I knew it wasn't Shakespeare, and I knew it wasn't 20th century, but I couldn't quite work out what it was. So after it was finished, I ran to my mother and I said, "Mother, I hope I will not offend you if I say that you seem to me to be in every way the visible personification of absolute perfection." She said, "I beg your pardon." And I explained to her what I'd been watching. And when she eventually unpicked my breathless gushing about this thing, she said, "Oh, that was the importance of being earnest." And there wasn't a copy of it in the house. My parents had a fire in one of the book rooms, and then probably it had been destroyed. So I waited for the library to come. This is a very long answer to your question.
No, I love it.
And I got on, and I said to the little librarian woman who had sort of half-moon spectacles and beads and powdery cheeks, I said, "Do you have anything by Oscar Wilde?" And she said, "Oh, yes, we've got the plays of Oscar Wilde." And so I took them home, and I read the 4 great comedies, Woman of No Importance, and Lady Windermere's Fan, and the Importance of Being Oscar, of course. And I just became obsessed by it. I kept the book for about 2 or 3 weeks and then went back to the library and asked if they had any more. And then I got the complete works, and I read such of those as I could understand, some of the political essays and other such things. The more philosophical works were obviously a bit beyond me. But I was the children's fairy tales and other things. I just loved reading them. And then I went back and said, "Have you got anything more?" And she said, "Well, that was the complete works. There won't be any more." And then I spotted, and I looked around the shelves, I saw a book called The Trials of Oscar Wilde. I said, "Oh, I'll take that." She said, "Well, I think you might be a bit young for that." I said, No, honestly, I read very much above my age," or something like that. She said, "Well, all right then." And she stamped the book, and I took it, and I read about this extraordinary man, this generous, warm-hearted, almost messianic. He had disciples, friends, a circle of people. He was so charming and extraordinary. And then, with my heart thumping, I read about his fall. And even at that age, I knew that this was something that connected to me. I wouldn't have articulated that I was gay. Well, we didn't use the word back then in the 1960s or early 70s, whatever it was. But I just knew that this was me. And suddenly I connected him with everything that I loved in terms of language, because the importance had shown me that this thing you and I are using now, this thing we use to exchange and to ask someone to pass the salt or to pick up a phone and order a pizza or whatever, this same thing can be used to beguile and seduce and delight and entrance, and can be used as a painter uses paint or a dancer uses their body. It is something so remarkable, language, and Wilde brought that alive to me, which was very important because I couldn't sing or dance, and I was hopeless at athletics or sports of any kind, and I couldn't sing. So I suddenly realized all I had was my language, and that I was perhaps unique amongst my friends in thinking that language was something important, that it was for more than just the exchange of ideas, or, as I say, for the asking someone to pass the mustard. So Wilde taught me that, but at the same time, he taught me that there was something dark and terrible in store for me in my future life, because I started to read about his friends and look through bibliographies, the way you do in the days before hyperlinks.
Right. The Encyclopedia Britannica.
Exactly, and indexes and the card index of a library where you can just join dots and make connections. And so I found out about all of Wilde's friends and people who were influenced by him. And so many of them, of course, were gay, and so many of them ended their lives either in disgrace or in sort of alcoholic ruin in Tangier or with Paul Bowles and, a set of decadent figures in Capri or somewhere like that. And it was both glamorous and enchanting, but also slightly frightening. So Wilde was everything to me. He opened the door to literature. He showed me the way in, and that changed my life completely, but it was also personal. So the idea that I would ever play him in a film, of course, was just absolutely out. But it was the British playwright and wonderful figure, Alan Bennett. I was in Joe Allen's in London, and he just passed by my table, and he said, I've been watching you. He said, and you've grown your hair, and you should play Oscar Wilde one day. You look just like him, and you've got the mannerisms. And then he drifted away. And I thought, it had never occurred to me. And then I looked at myself in the mirror and I parted my hair in the middle. I thought, maybe I do.
Well, that's like a prophecy. What year was that?
Yes, that's right. I mean, that was about 5 years before the film happened. And then it all sort of, I got in, asked if I would take part in this film. And, as an actor, as Clint Eastwood says I think it's in Magnum Force, he says to Hal Holbrook, a man's got to know his limitations. And it's particularly true of an actor. I think you've got to know your limitations. And I always knew I was never going to get the parts that Brad Pitt had just turned down. But maybe there would be the odd part that could be more than just a villain or a sort of comic silly character or something. And that Wilde was one such where I could actually play a lead.
I'm not surprised that Alan Bennett somehow figured into that story, but the idea that Clint Eastwood would somehow enter in, I didn't expect, I have to admit.
I have a wide palette of references.
Did you, when you say that, he opened you up to language, reading his work, did that affect you at that point? You were, as you said, 10 or 11 years old. Did that affect you primarily as a reader, or also did you start to write at that time?
No, it did as a writer as well. There's something about his rhythms which are so exquisite. And indeed, that's a very Wildean thing to say, exquisite rather than exquisite. I found that I could learn the language of Wilde's sentences, whole paragraphs from The Importance to start with, and then from other works, simply because the rhythms of them sat in the brain exactly right. In the same way as you can't rewrite the opening bars of Beethoven's Fifth, it wouldn't make sense. That's the way the notes fall. So it is in that sort of writing. It gives you a template for what the prosodic word is, the quantity of language, the actual weight and heft of a particular word in the sentence and how a sentence swings and changes. And then other writers, some of them, in fact, they were my World Wide Web, my WWW, when I was a teenager, were on the light side of things, P.G. Wodehouse, who was a magnificent prose master, and Evelyn Waugh, the British novelist, a male Evelyn. He wrote Brideshead Revisited and Decline and Fall and many extraordinary satirical novels. And again, an absolute master of prose. And those three, perhaps with the addition, oddly, from an earlier age as a child, again, a marvellous kind of magisterial prose master was Arthur Conan Doyle. I used to love Sherlock Holmes, and there was something about that language too. It was sort of marmoreal, it had a kind of permanence, it's a rightness, it sat in the ear. And I think those sort of writers always appealed to me. Cyril Connolly, who was a great critic, founded Horizon magazine, and he was a friend of all the writers of the Bloomsbury Group and many others in the 20th century. He wrote a book called Enemies of Promise, in the first half of which he talks about two types of writing. He talks about Mandarin and non-Mandarin. And what he's talking about prose aesthetics. And of course, the biggest thing to happen to English prose in the 20th century probably was Ernest Hemingway, who was an enormous influence on a great many writers. I have nothing but the profoundest admiration for Hemingway, but it's not the way I could ever use language. I can't be that simple, that fantastically bald, use those sort of repetitions. I mean, Nick saw the fish saw Nick.
Right.
All that. It's brilliant when you read it. And that contrasts exactly with what Connolly called the Mandarin, which is the the florid, the orotund, the wordy. And in fact, even we're going to come on to these books on Greek myths at one point, but funnily enough, when I was writing the first one, Mythos, I was about halfway through it when I suddenly heard through a friend that our mutual friend, Neil Gaiman, the writer, had just finished writing a book on Norse mythology. And I was terrified to think that maybe he was doing a series and that his next one would be Greek mythology, which I was writing. So I wrote to Neil, whom I know, and I said, Neil, I've just heard that you've written this book. Apparently it's marvellous. I can't wait to read it, of course. And then I explained my quandary. I said, do I give up writing this book on Greek myth? He said, no, don't worry. And he sent me an early manuscript of his, or, PDFs, of course, as they are now, of the book. And in my reply to him, I said, your spare, wondrous storytelling fits the Norse world so well. I'm hoping that my profligate, frankly, harlotish style of writing, its floridity, its fullness, suits the Mediterranean, profusion of the Greek world, because I can't write like you, but I so admire it. And we batted back and forth a bit about that. And it's a thing a writer has to understand. I mean, particularly America, because Hemingway was American and was of such influence, but thriller writers, and I'm a huge admirer, incidentally, of someone like Lee Child and his Jack Reach books. And when he started, you could see he quite deliberately it was his first book. And there he is stripping it of every adverb. And Stephen King wrote a book, didn't he, about his style guide, as it were.
Yes, on writing.
And again, no adverbs, no this, no that. And I've tried to do that with my writing. And I thought, no, it's no good, Stephen. This is the writer you are. And if people think it's overwritten, if they think it's over florid, then so be it. They'll have to put the book down and turn to someone with a spare style. But I can't do it. I just can't. And unfortunately, enough people don't mind to allow me to carry on that way.
Well, Greek mythology seems made for the Mandarin style and maybe even for Wilde and that influence. But you've written memoirs, you've written novels. What made you sit down and think what I really need to do is rewrite or write a version of the Greek myths?
It was a moment I was having dinner with some friends, and I can't remember how the subject came up, but someone was talking about, it wasn't an over-pretentious dinner party discussion, but it was about the way different cultures explain how the world came to be. And, we were saying, is Genesis a terrible myth? Is it all about guilt and shame? And are there better ones? And so I started to talk about, the Greek origin myths, and then went back a bit to the, out of chaos and Uranos and Gaia. And everyone started staring at me and saying, go on. I said, well, and then I get the next generation, and I was talking, about Kronos and then the birth of Zeus, and they were going, wow, how do you know all this? And I said, well, I used to love Greek myths, and a lot of them were far more intelligent than I, and probably better read, but they knew the names. Everyone knows the names Zeus and Apollo and so on, but they hadn't joined the dots. And it's a miraculous thing about Greek mythology that there is a timeline and a chronology. I mean, it's probably reverse engineered by Hesiod and Homer and the later poets, obviously. But nonetheless, it has a shape, a beginning and an end, which other mythic structures don't seem to have. And they're so deep in I hesitate to use such a cliche, but I can't avoid it, in the DNA of our own culture and art, that it's kind of part of who we are. So they encouraged me, really, and a lot of people said, you've got to retell those stories. And at first I thought I'd do it as a stage show, and then I started writing it and realized what pleasure it was to research and go back to some of the sources that I remember and find out and fill in the gaps that in my own knowledge, that I started writing.
Did that mobile library play a part in your early reading of the Greek myths as well?
Yes, it did. And funnily enough, it was American mythologists who were the biggest influence on me when I was young, apart from Robert Graves, who was hugely influential, who wrote a magnificent 2-volume edition of the Greek myths. But when I was younger and too young for Robert Graves, it was Edith Hamilton and Bernard Evslin and Bullfinch. We had a copy of Bullfinch, which is American, I think, isn't it? The Bullfinch mythology, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, whom I remember well, reading those when I was very young. I had a big illustrated version of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Tanglewood Tales. And these were all wonderful retellings for children. And there was a British author called Roger Lancelyn Green, whom I also read as a boy. And at school, because I loved classics at school from a very early age. We were taught Latin from the age of 7 at my school, and I did so well at it, only because I think I did so badly at everything else, that I was put onto ancient Greek quite young too. I was 8 or 9 when I started learning ancient Greek, which I loved. And so those stories, of course, are the things you use for translations, and so I grew up with a lot of them.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned Edith Hamilton, because I brought home I was sent your new book, Heroes, and my 15-year-old daughter was already a super fan of Mythos, the first book, which came out a couple of years ago. And I asked her, well, what is it that you like that Stephen Fry does in these books? Because she's one of those kids that has read the Greek myths in many incarnations. And she said, well, it's very different from Edith Hamilton. And one of the differences and the things that I like best, and this surprised me, she said the footnotes. She said, normally you don't want to read footnotes, but here you actually do. And it's funny because you had written, I think in the introduction to Heroes, that plenty of readers enjoyed the first time around, that you thought that they might be annoying. I just talk about the footnotes and your decision around that.
They're such an interesting instrument, footnotes. They are a way of having an intimate conversation with the reader, which is of a different order to the kind you have in the main body of the prose or the text. And I don't know why that is. I use them because one of the things I find so deeply fascinating about Greek myths is that you can start to tell the story and something in it just wakes you up to language, for example. So very early on, one of the great stories of the birth of Zeus is how Kronos, who is married to Rhea, his sister, he's a Titan, and he has defeated Uranos, his father. He's gelded him. But in gelding his father Uranos, he is cursed by his father, who, grabbing his maimed genitals, says, "May you be brought down by your children, just as I have been brought down by you." And so he's terrified of having children, but he makes love to his wife Rhea, and each time she gives birth, first to a girl, Hestia, he eats the child, and then to a boy, Hades, he eats that baby, then to another girl, Demeter, eats that, then to another boy, Poseidon, eats that, and then Hera eats her, and then she's pregnant the 6th time. By this time, she hates Kronos, and she devises this plan. She goes to near Mount Othrys, where the Titans, it's there, Olympus, as it were. It's a kingdom or a province of Greece called Magnesia, near Thessaly, as we would say now. And she finds this stone, and the stones in Magnesia were quite special. The Greeks noticed that iron would be attracted to them. And so they gave this property of the stones from Magnesia the name of Magnesia, which is magnetite, stone of Magnesia, from which we get our word magnet, of course. And not only that, but we get magnesium, the element, and even manganese, the element, through a spelling mistake. So all these kind of things about that, interesting little sidelines, but you wouldn't want to disturb the story of her getting this stone, because she uses the stone in a wonderful, deceptive way. She drapes it in linen and puts it under her thighs and then makes the screams of childbirth, and Kronos comes along and she says, no, don't take this one. And he grabs the swaddled child, as he thinks, and swallows it down, and off he goes. And then she goes to Crete, still pregnant, of course, and gives birth to Zeus, who then gets his revenge on his father. And so the Olympian order is born. And it's a wonderful story. But you want to stop off at things like magnesium, just because it's so interesting, and how much of our language and science derives from Greek words and Greek places that we're not always familiar with. And I think a lot of people, especially curious children, find a thrill in linking words to stories and ideas, that discovering the words aren't always just quite such arbitrary signs.
In the main text, you're addressing the reader directly very frequently, but it feels as if in the footnotes, you're then kind of pulling them aside in a more intimate way. How do you deal with that when you're doing the audiobook?
Good question. That's a very good point. You have to chat with your producer, and you say, now, I think this one we just won't bother with because it really does get in the way. Or this one we can do at the end of the story, or maybe the end of that chapter, or it may just be a natural paragraph, rather than where I've embedded the footnote in the text in the book. For the audio, one will probably find another place for it. But one has to be constantly thinking of those things.
I want to pause for just a moment and play for our listeners a sample from the audiobook.
Mum, what's Medusa? Perseus, have you been drinking? Maybe. Just a cup or two. A hiccup or two by the sound of it. No, but seriously, what's a Medusa? Why do you want to know? I heard the name and wondered, that's all. Well, if you'll stop pacing around like a caged lion and sit down, I'll tell you, said Danae. Medusa, so they say, was a beautiful young woman who was taken and ravished by the sea god Poseidon. Ravished? Unfortunately for her, this took place on the floor of a temple sacred to the goddess Athena. She was so angry at the sacrilege that she punished Medusa. She didn't punish Poseidon. The gods don't punish each other, at least not very often. They punish us. And how did Athena punish Medusa? She transformed her into a Gorgon. Blimey, said Perseus. And what's a Gorgon?
That was an excerpt from the audio edition of Stephen Fry's Heroes. I want to ask specifically about the audio recording, because you mentioned that your original idea of doing the Greek myths was as a play. So did the audio give you that opportunity to bring whatever it was that you had wanted to that version?
It did, yes. I'd pictured that I would do a stage show in which I sat in an armchair and told the stories. I've always had this slight antipathy towards the almost universally accepted idea that the best fictional mode is showing, not telling. It's a cliche of Hollywood and of even of, school story competitions and so on, is don't tell, show. And sometimes I think telling is better. And I think audiobooks are a good example of how that is the case, how language living in the brain is enough. And I saw this show where I would sit in a chair, because the thing that I think really excites me about Greek myths is this idea of our ancestors thousands of years ago, before writing, but once language had arrived, which is 50,000 years, most people would say. 50,000 years ago, our ancestors, they'd already had tools and fire, and now they had language. And these things protected them enormously because they could plan and they could discuss things with each other, and they could make their lives safer and more secure. So there they are in their cave or their hut, whatever it might be, around a fire. And they've had a hard day's planting and hunting and doing all the other things that they would do. And it's at this point that the children and indeed some of the adults will ask the questions that language allows you to ask. Why does the sun always disappear at the end of the day? Why does the moon come up instead? Or is that the sun looking different? Or why do some mountains rumble with fire? Who brings the rain? Because when there's a force in the world, an agency, you give that agency a name. If you can't explain it, you give it a personality, which is just another way of saying you call it a god. And that's what our ancestors always did. So there was a god of growing, because anything that moved, any force, including leaves coming out of branches, had to be explained. Who pushes those leaves out? And so Demeter, the goddess of growth and fertility, is responsible for that, and so on. And light comes from Aethra or from Apollo. And all of this was telling. It was sitting around telling stories. And those stories are transmitted from brain to brain and mouth to mouth. And yes, there's a certain amount of showing. Some people then do drawings of them and statues and so on. But the statues only really live, only have meaning when someone explains them in language. And in this great rush to be so excited by showing, not telling, and in a culture which is a culture of spectacle, I loved the idea of doing a theatre show which was actually just talking. And there'd be a few lights and other things. And indeed, after the first book, Mythos, came out, and while I just was writing Heroes, I did do the show. I did it in Canada at the Shore Festival in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and then did a tour around Britain. And in fact, I'm due to do it in Australia later this year, though that's obviously all up in the air because of the COVID.
Well, in 2021, let's say.
Yes.
Until then, I urge our listeners to listen to Stephen Fry tell the stories of heroes, but also to pick up the book and Mythos, because these are really beautifully produced books with incredible artwork. They're really like gift items. And also to go back and watch that 1997 film Wild, which also features a very young Jude Law. I despised him for so long after he was so terrible as Bosie. I mean, good terrible. Watch him be jostled very briefly in A Fish Called Wanda, to read one of his many memoirs and his novels. Stephen, it has been such a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you. A delight.
Stephen Fry's latest book is called Heroes, The Greek Myths Reimagined.
Those were our conversations with Jennifer Egan and Stephen Fry. We'll have more from the Book Review Podcast archive next week. Thank you for listening.